In December 2020, the news of Paolo Rossi's death did not arrive like the end of an ordinary football life. It landed with the strange, heavy silence that only follows the disappearance of someone who had once belonged to an entire nation's happiest memory. He was 64 years old when he died after battling illness, but the age, the medical details, the cold facts of mortality all felt smaller than the emotional shock that followed. Because to millions of people, Paolo Rossi was never just a former striker. He was the face of a summer that had become myth. He was the man who had made Italy believe again in 1982, the man who had stood in front of Brazil, in front of pressure, in front of doubt itself, and somehow turned all of it into glory. That is why the image of his death carried such force. The boyish predator of the penalty box, the hero with the light frame and the deadly instinct, the smiling symbol of a nation's most beautiful footballing dream, all of that suddenly collapsed into the simple, brutal truth that even legends leave quietly. There was no stadium, no roar, no blue shirt lifted under floodlights. There was only the stillness that comes when the body of a national icon gives out, and the world is left staring at the distance between the man it remembers and the silence that remains. For a country that had spent decades seeing Paolo Rossi as the embodiment of a miracle, the ending felt unbearably small, unbearably human, and therefore even more painful. What made his death so haunting was not only who Paolo Rossi had been, but what he represented. Some footballers are remembered for numbers, some for trophies, some for beauty. Rossi was remembered for resurrection. He had not simply won. He had come back from disgrace, from suspension, from suspicion, from the possibility that his career might already be over, and then returned to the greatest stage in the sport to become immortal. That arc changed the meaning of his life in the public imagination. He was never just a champion. He was redemption made visible. And that is why the news of his passing felt like more than grief. It felt like the death of one of football's rarest stories, the story of a man who fell, rose, and then became forever tied to one shining national memory. When the tributes began, they did not sound like routine farewells to a retired athlete. They sounded like a country trying to say goodbye to a part of itself. Paolo Rossi had once given Italy a version of joy so complete that it survived long after the final whistle. And now, with his death, that old joy returned in a darker form, not as celebration, but as mourning. That is where this story begins. Not with the first kick of a ball, and not with the making of a star, but with the moment the hero of 1982 was gone, and the world was forced to ask how a man who once stood at the center of triumph came to leave behind such a quiet, aching emptiness. Long before Paolo Rossi became the face of an Italian miracle, he was just a boy from Prato, growing up far from the kind of spotlight that would later turn him into legend. Unlike some football icons, he did not arrive carrying the aura of an unstoppable prodigy. His path was thinner, more fragile, more uncertain than that. Juventus identified him young and brought him into their system at just 15, but even then, the future did not unfold in a straight line. He was slight, not physically imposing, and in his early years he was used wide rather than through the middle, as if the game itself had not yet decided what he truly was. Injuries followed him early, especially knee problems, and that matters because it gives his youth a very different emotional tone from the myth that would come later. Before the world knew the smiling finisher of 1982, there was a young player trying to survive pain, waiting for his body and his role to stop working against him. His first team debut with Juventus came in 1974, but it was too early, too small, too incomplete to feel like destiny. Then came a short, unconvincing spell at Como, where he made only a handful of Serie A appearances and failed to score. At that stage, Paolo Rossi did not look like the future hero of Italy. He looked like one more talented young footballer who might never find the exact shape his career needed. What changed everything was not fame, but position. At Vicenza, Rossi was moved into the center of the attack, and suddenly his whole career began to make sense. The winger became a striker. The uncertainty became instinct. The player who had seemed too light, too vulnerable, too easily overlooked, began to reveal the thing that would define him forever. An almost unnatural talent for appearing in the right place at the exact right moment. In his first season there, he scored 21 goals in Serie B and helped Vicenza win promotion. Then, in the very next season, he scored 24 in Serie A and led the club to a stunning second-place finish, turning himself from a promising young player into one of the most discussed forwards in Italy. That is the version of Paolo Rossi that matters most in this part of the story. Not the little boy, but the young man finally discovering who he was. He was not built like a superstar, and he did not dominate through force. He grew into danger through intelligence, timing, and hunger. Before the scandal, before the exile, before the resurrection, there was this: a young striker finding his true position and, in doing so, quietly stepping into the first light of destiny. Paolo Rossi did not become famous in the loud, obvious way some stars do. His rise felt lighter than that, sharper, almost deceptive at first glance. He did not overpower defenders with size, and he did not dominate matches by looking bigger than everyone else on the pitch. What made him dangerous was something far more unsettling. He seemed to understand where football was about to go before anyone else did. At Vicenza, that instinct finally found its perfect stage. After being moved into the center of the attack, Rossi stopped looking like a talented player still searching for himself and started looking like a striker who had discovered his true language. In Serie B, he scored 21 goals and helped take Vicenza up. Then, in Serie A, he scored 24 more and drove the club to an astonishing second-place finish, a feat so unexpected that it instantly changed the scale of his reputation. Suddenly, he was no longer a promising young player with an interesting story. He was one of the most exciting forwards in Italy. Juventus's own history of Rossi describes Vicenza as the place where he truly exploded, the moment when the uncertainty of his early years gave way to the kind of scoring form that could no longer be ignored. That stage of his life matters because it gave him a public identity for the first time. He was quick, intelligent, elusive, and strangely calm in front of goal. He looked fragile until the chance arrived, and then suddenly, he looked inevitable. This was the first version of Paolo Rossi the wider football world fell in love with. Not yet immortal, not yet myth, but already dangerous enough to make people believe something much bigger was coming. That belief grew even stronger at the 1978 World Cup, where Rossi stepped onto a global stage and turned himself from an Italian sensation into an international name. He scored 3 goals in Argentina, and with each game the image of him became clearer. The light frame, the alert movement, the strange predator's timing, the ability to arrive exactly where defenders least wanted him. This was the tournament that helped create Pablito, the affectionate nickname that made him feel less like an ordinary player and more like a figure the public could emotionally claim as its own. FIFA notes that his club form had earned him a place in Italy's squad, and those performances confirmed that he was no longer only part of Italy's future, he was already becoming one of its central hopes. That is what makes this part of the story so important. Paolo Rossi's rise was not just about goals. It was about becoming a symbol before he had even reached his ultimate peak. He represented a style of forward play that was subtle rather than theatrical, intelligent rather than overwhelming, and somehow all the more memorable because of that. By the end of the 1970s, Rossi was no longer simply a striker with promise. He was one of the brightest faces of Italian football, a young man whose career seemed to be moving in only one direction. The public had started to believe in him. The country had started to imagine what he might become. And that is always a dangerous moment in stories like this. The point where admiration hardens into expectation, and expectation begins to build the pressure that can either crown a player forever or help break him apart. The fall of Paolo Rossi did not come when his body failed him or when age finally caught up with his talent. It came much earlier, at the exact moment when his future seemed brightest. In 1980, Italian football was rocked by the Totonero betting scandal, and Rossi, one of the country's most admired young forwards, was pulled into a storm that threatened to erase everything he had built. Whatever the legal arguments, whatever the debates that would continue for years, the emotional reality was devastatingly simple. The rising star of Italian football was suddenly suspended, shamed, and pushed out of the game at the very moment when he should have been moving toward his prime. For a player whose public image had been built on intelligence, movement, and trust, that kind of stain was catastrophic. Suspensions do more than stop careers. They freeze identity. They trap a player between what he was and what the world is now willing to believe about him. That is what makes this chapter so dark. Paolo Rossi did not just lose matches. He lost momentum, credibility, rhythm, and the simple certainty that the path ahead was still his. While Italy moved on and football kept spinning without him, he remained suspended inside a kind of emotional exile. The striker who had seemed destined for greatness was now a name attached to suspicion, arguments, and disappointment. By the time the ban was reduced and his return became possible, he was no longer coming back as a hero in waiting. He was coming back as a question mark, a damaged reputation, a player people talked about with doubt in their voices. Even when he rejoined Juventus, there was no universal sense of triumph. There was tension, there was skepticism. There was the uncomfortable feeling that perhaps his story had already peaked too early, and that whatever remained would only be the long shadow of what might have been. In stories like this, that is usually the point where greatness quietly dies. Not with a dramatic ending, but with the slow public loss of belief. And that is exactly why what happened next felt almost impossible. When Paolo Rossi went to the 1982 World Cup, he did not arrive as a man everyone trusted. He arrived under pressure, short of sharpness, and carrying the residue of exile. In the early matches, he looked rusty, subdued, almost disconnected from the tournament, and criticism came quickly. People asked why he had been chosen. They asked whether he was finished. They asked whether the player Italy remembered even still existed. Then came Brazil, and suddenly, the whole story changed. Against the most dazzling team in the world, Rossi scored a hat trick that did more than win a match. It shattered doubt. It resurrected his name in one explosive afternoon. Then he scored twice against Poland in the semi-final. Then he opened the scoring in the final against West Germany. 6 goals in 3 matches, Golden Boot, World Cup winner, from disgrace to national hero in the span of a single tournament. That transformation is why Paolo Rossi remains such a powerful figure in football history. He did not simply return to form. He turned his return into redemption on the biggest stage the game could offer. The man who had once looked finished became the face of Italy's greatest modern triumph. The player once discussed through scandal was now remembered through celebration, tears, and blue shirts lifted toward the sky. And that is what makes his story feel larger than sport. Paolo Rossi gave people one of the rarest things any fallen figure can ever give the world. Not just a comeback, but a comeback so complete that it rewrote the meaning of everything that came before it. In 1982, he did not erase the darkness. He outran it just long enough to become immortal. When Paolo Rossi was laid to rest in Vicenza in December 2020, the farewell did not feel like a routine goodbye to a former footballer. It felt like Italy stepping out to honor a memory it had never really stopped carrying. Thousands of mourners gathered in the city for his funeral, and the image itself was powerful enough to feel cinematic without any embellishment. The coffin of the hero of 1982 carried into the cathedral by his former World Cup winning teammates, men who had once shared the greatest summer of his life and now returned to walk beside him one final time. Because of pandemic restrictions, only a limited number of people could enter the church, but the grief had already overflowed beyond any walls. In the days before the funeral, thousands had paid their respects at Stadio Menti, where his coffin was placed so ordinary people could say goodbye. That detail matters, because it tells you exactly what Paolo Rossi still meant to Italy. He was not being mourned only by the football world, only by old teammates, only by officials and cameras. He was being mourned by people who remembered where they were when he scored against Brazil, by people who still spoke of 1982 not as a tournament, but as a national feeling. In those crowds, the years seemed to collapse. The young striker called Pablito, the disgraced player who came back from suspension, the smiling champion in blue, and the man now gone at 64, all became one figure again. And for a moment, the funeral in Vicenza looked less like the end of a career than the closing of a chapter in Italy's emotional history. That is why Paolo Rossi's legacy remains so moving even beyond football. Plenty of great players are remembered for excellence. Rossi is remembered for transformation. He is remembered because his career contains one of sport's most irresistible shapes: rise, fall, exile, return, redemption, immortality. FIFA still describes him as a national hero, and that phrase fits because he was never just a striker who scored 6 goals at the 1982 World Cup. He became the emotional face of a country's rebirth, the player who turned doubt into belief, and who gave Italy a triumph that still lives in the national imagination with unusual warmth. The darkness of the scandal never disappeared completely, and perhaps that is part of why the story still feels human. Paolo Rossi was not a flawless idol preserved in perfection. He was a man who passed through disgrace and still found a way to touch the highest light the sport could offer. That makes the ending more affecting, not less. By the time he died, what remained was not just the golden boot, not just the final against West Germany, not just the famous hat trick against Brazil. What remained was the feeling that he had once made something impossible happen, and that entire generations had carried that miracle with them ever since. Maybe that is the truest way to understand why his death hit so hard. Italy did not simply lose a former champion. It lost the man who had once turned a wounded career into a nation's happiest memory. And perhaps that is why Paolo Rossi still feels larger than the record books. Some heroes are remembered because they were always destined for greatness. Paolo Rossi is remembered because he fell, came back, and for one unforgettable summer made redemption look real.